as Canadians, I think regardless of what your socioeconomic position is, we are extremely fortunate and wealthy compared to many, many other people in the world. We have that component of we expect that developing nations are going to forego their sort of economic and social benefits from the energy consumption that we've had because we don't want them to emit. And I think that that is incredibly unkind and unfair. But then, there's also like bringing it down very local. There are a lot of people here in Canada and in Alberta who are struggling to pay their bills. And so again, it's like, how do you expect people to pay more when they're struggling to meet their basic needs?
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Dialogue Over Division. And today I have with me Deidra Garyk. And Deidra is an energy advocate and a sustainability specialist. And I'm not 100% sure what that is all about. So I'm going to ask Deidra to give us a little bit more of an introduction about who she is and how she got into these areas, which there's a lot of people talking about these things, and I don't know if they have the full scope of what they are. So I'm really excited for this conversation.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much, Eva. I am really excited to be on your podcast. I've been following you for the last few years as you've kind of come onto the scenes as a really strong advocate for civil liberties. And I think some of the energy advocacy work that I do kind of ties back into all of this too. And so I think that there'll be some nice synergy, and hopefully we'll get into that in a little bit. But a quick bio on me. I am a born and raised Albertan. I'm a girl who's worked in the oil patch for 20 years, so kind of shapes my perspectives on the world as well as my perspectives on ESG and sustainability. About 6 years ago now, I accidentally fell into energy advocacy. It wasn't anything I planned, but as the industry was struggling with its very severe economic downturn, which very materially impacted the workers and by extension their families and the communities where they live and or operate if they're companies, there was a lot of devastation here. And so I did the only thing I knew how to do is I wrote an open letter to Justin Trudeau when the Federal Court of Appeal canceled or put a halt on the Trans Mountain pipeline. And I just expressed my displeasure at what was happening. And it happened to go viral. I was never a content creator. I had very, very few followers on any social media platforms. And it all just kind of went from there. Energy Now picked it up and asked me to continue writing for them. They felt that there was a lack of female voices in the energy and energy advocacy space in particular. And I agree with them. And I still think, we've got a lot of great women in the industry, and I'd love to hear more from them. But I'm honored to get to be a voice for this industry of very industrious, hardworking, committed people. And then by extension, I got brought into the ESG sustainability space for an oil field services company. And I worked dedicated to that area for about 3 years. And I have very recently left the corporate world and started my own sustainability consulting business called Equipois Advisory. And I'll share a little bit about the name because I know it's probably a little unique. So Equipois is a harmonious balance between different perspectives. And that's really something that I try to bring to all of my ESG and sustainability work. There's a lot of division and with the Republican states down south, there's a lot of division and there's a very strong anti-ESG movement happening. And so I'm trying to kind of find this stable equilibrium to comply, but also find ways to help companies meet and improve their business practices. And so I think that because of my time in the oil patch, as well as my energy advocacy work, I approach ESG from quite a different perspective than a lot of other people.
Well, I really want to delve into that because I don't know much about this area at all, like I mentioned. And then I do hear the words or the term ESG a lot, sustainability, and lots of people think it's total hocus pocus. Lots of people think that it's that it be all and end all. So I already can see where you seem to be coming at it, like trying to find a balance. But can you just share a little bit, like what kind of work you did in the oil patch? I'm curious about that as well.
Sure. So, roughly my first 15 years in the industry was spent in joint venture contracts. And so, what that is, the name's a little bit of a misnomer, but I worked more on the midstream side. So, I was involved with negotiating the deals either for joint ownership of facilities, plants, pipelines, compressors, batteries, what have you, but also negotiating access into other companies' infrastructure, or on the other side, companies would negotiate with us to gain access to my company's infrastructure. And with that comes, obviously costs for the use of that infrastructure and sort of how are we going to operate things and making sure that all the billing is done correctly. So I had to partner with our direct competitors all of the time. So I think, again, that's probably a different perspective that I bring to the ESG sustainability space, because ESG is all about kind of, what are these stakeholder relations? How do you work with a large group of people? It's larger than our traditional financial way of looking at things, which has specifically been shareholder rights, shareholder priorities. What does the shareholder need? Now it's stakeholders, and stakeholders is very broad. But again, I think that's where I'm kind of used to having to work alongside multiple groups of people with different interests. So yeah, we'll call it like the commercial side of the midstreaming was the side that I was on for quite a while, and then moved over to the oil field services side, and that's where I got into ESG and sustainability.
Okay, and I promise we're going to get into that, but I wanted to hear a little bit too, because you were talking about how with the oil, when it took a bit of a fall, the cost, I think, um, and it really affected families in Alberta. So can we just talk about that a little bit too? Like, um, how much Alberta families depend on, and Canada depends on this industry. So maybe let's set the tone about that first, and then how that affects Canadian families and in turn Canada. So what is the impact of the energy sector in Alberta or in Canada, and then when it takes a bit of a dive in terms of costs and pricing?
So, yeah, this is something that I feel very strongly about, because I think there's been such a political polarization of oil and gas, and it sort of negates the human aspect of the industry and all of the workers. And I don't kind of have my stats in front of me right now, but you always kind of hear there's roughly about 500,000 direct and indirect jobs related to the oil and gas industry. So when there's a nosedive in prices, there are a lot of people that are affected. During the peak of the downturn, I heard a number of something like 125,000 people were unemployed within the oil and gas industry. And I believe that may have been Alberta. I'm forgetting, because that seems like so long ago, even though it was only a few years ago. But it just kind of shows you the impact of price drops. And part of the other thing that I think is really important for people to know is that because we export so much to the US, like the majority of our exports of oil and gas go down to the US. Like we have one buyer for most of it, and that means that they have a lot of control over prices. And so our products we don't attract those world prices. And so even though other oil producing nations were impacted by by lower global oil commodity prices, Alberta was really hit extra hard, or Canada was hit extra hard. But because Alberta is so incredibly dependent on the oil and gas sector for royalty revenues and jobs, et cetera, we really, really felt it in Alberta. And I'm sure even though you're not directly involved in the industry, you probably felt it in some way as well as an Alberta.
Yeah, well, actually, my earlier career was very much in this area in terms of landowner work. So I was representing landowners when there was proposed development on their land. So it was my industry, really, but in a different way. And I got challenged a lot by people in Alberta saying that, I represent landowners and I'm a tree hugger. And really, it was just about responsible development and property rights. These are farmers and some of them even working in the industry were people that we represented. And anyway, it's always funny because I was once termed um, a tree hugger, and now sometimes I'm being called a right-wing extremist. And I'm like, I think I'm somewhere in the middle. I don't think I'm either of those, but anyway, and so I did want to touch on that a little bit because it does affect so many of us. So you mentioned that in your introduction. I appreciated that. And then the last thing I did want to talk about, and then I think this ties now into the ESG and where that really movement came from as well. And correct me if I'm wrong, but we heard a lot of people vilifying the industry. And this is like, celebrities saying things that, and I suspect that, doesn't help. You started your last answer with how much it's been politicized. So I think that goes to that politicization, and then people without really appreciating the good, the efforts that are being made and the bad. But it's just like, okay, Leonardo DiCaprio said that this is not good. So clearly this is not good. So, and then do you think that led into this kind of ESG world, or maybe not?
Well, the ESG world, if we'll call it that, has been in the works for quite some time. But I think you're right. Probably the globalization of communication, the easy access to hear what a variety of people have to say through social media, texts, etc., that travel around the world in a second, has meant that certain people maybe have a disproportionate influence on the conversation. And frustratingly, it is people like, Jane Fonda or Leonardo DiCaprio who consume vast amounts of oil and gas and yet vilify it at all turns. And I think the challenge that I have, and I think it's incumbent upon all of us within the industry to do a better job of educating, is that we have to educate people. It's humorous. I'll just share this story. I'm connected to a lot of people on LinkedIn who are not pro oil and gas, and so there was one person who put out a post. It was anti-oil. Like we gotta shut this down immediately. We have to stop using it immediately. And some guy said, "Oh yeah, I stopped using all of their products like 2 months ago," and I laughed because here's a person who has just no understanding. Like he clearly doesn't know that his plastic computer or phone or whatever he was typing on is made from these products, right? And most electricity around the world still comes from some sort of hydrocarbon, whether it's coal, oil, or natural gas, not so much oil, but other products. And so I think we're kind of living in a world where we're idealistic and devoid of reality a lot of times. And so I'm hoping that some of the things that we're maybe seeing down south with the changes to the what will be the changes to the government down south will start to adjust that narrative to something a little more energy realist. I'll share this with your audience because I'm very excited about it. Chris Wright, who's the CEO of Liberty Energy, which is a hydraulic fracturing company, he has been nominated to be the Secretary of Energy. He is probably one of the most well, bold, very courageous, has spoken out very eloquently against a lot of the activism. He's pragmatic and he's an energy realist, and he pushes back against climate alarmism just so fantastically that I think we're going to hopefully start to see a shift in the narrative away from alarmism, fear, um, ideology in our conversation about energy, and moving to a bit more realism so that we can collectively implement better energy policy.
So I was going to go to ESG, but I now want to just ask you, where do you think that the alarmism came from?
Oh, yeah, this is a really good one. So the I think this ties back in with the ESG movement as well. So I think, we're still kind of staying on topic, even though I recognize I'm kind of going all over the place. Uh, but I mean, this sort of well, it wasn't called climate, but this climate movement has been around since the 80s. I mean, it was introduced by the UN. It's always been sort of like sustainable development or something within that vein. We had the UN Global Compact in 2000. And that's also the same time that the World Economic Forum started to promote this stakeholder capitalism, which was, again, a shift from the prioritization of shareholders' needs to a much broader stakeholder. And, stakeholders can encompass anyone and everyone, and it sort of depends what the frameworks decide is a stakeholder that you would have to consider and consult with. Um, then, we started to have, in the 2010s, I think companies started to see that maybe there was an opportunity to make some money off of this environmental movement. And so you did start to see the big asset managers like the BlackRocks, the Vanguards, the State Streets. They started to put pressure on companies to start disclosing. And I think it was typically called corporate social responsibility. So these things have kind of morphed over the years. And, again, the World Economic Forum gets even more involved in a lot of this, and they continue to stay very influential um, in in what they expect of their members, who are often larger, very influential companies, as well as government officials. And so I'm not saying that, they're necessarily phoning CEOs and or Justin Trudeau and telling them what to say, but there's a level of sort of collective influence. There's, the social stigmas of not being on side with what those kind of organizations want. I think that people who think that, heads of companies and states are immune from the human requirement to feel like they belong and want to acquiesce to kind of the crowd. I think, we're naive to think that those people are devoid of those kind of human requirements. And so I think they often just sort of go along. They go along to get along. But I think that also, ESG is the financial underpinnings for how they are trying to reshape our societies. Some people call it social engineering, re-engineering. But you do see that we have a lot of very influential people, including Mark Carney, who is now an advisor to the Liberal Party here in Canada. He's been instrumental in creating frameworks and unaccountable, unelected bodies, net zero emissions bodies, financial related bodies that focus on like emissions reductions or certain things. He's been very instrumental in creating these kind of arm's length bodies that have been very influential within the movement and kind of reshaping society in the image that they want.
Okay, so now we're going to dig deep into here so
Okay.
let's just do a little, like, I always go back to university. ESG 101. What exactly is it? What does it stand for? And then like just super basic information for somebody that's never heard the term before.
Sure. So ESG stands for environmental, social, and governance. And so every company's ESG metrics or topics are kind of unique to their own. I'm going to talk about oil and gas because that's my area of expertise and, kind of what I'm most familiar with. But, you can extract it to a number of other industries. So for the oil and gas industry, environment would be emissions, number one, emissions. But water usage, that's something that's very important to the industry, to getting the production out of the ground. It's everything from, particulate matter, what are you doing with maybe biodiversity and your land use? That would certainly be a big part of your environmental component of the ESG, something you're familiar with, Eva. And then you have social, and that's everything from, how are you treating your employees? And, if we look back on the COVID days, there would have been a requirement for you to have and disclose sort of what are your COVID policies and practices? How are you protecting your employees? For oil and gas, health and safety is extremely, extremely important. So that's an S component. But you also have how are you treating the communities that you operate in? What are you doing within those kind of spaces? And then G is governance, and basically that's kind of don't be a corrupt company. What is your governance structure? Do you have a board? Do you have anti-corruption policies? All of those kind of things. And I think, a lot of that stuff is very, very commendable. I think companies should treat the environment well. They should treat their people well and respect the communities they work in. They should absolutely have strong governance structures and not be corrupt. But we have sort of seen, I think, I'll call it scope creep, within the social. What kind of really came up over the last couple of years was more of that DEI stuff, diversity, equity, and inclusion. So you have these asset managers like BlackRock, et cetera. They are trying to set certain diversity targets. They want, typically they want 30% women on boards and within executive teams, and the oil and gas industry always struggles with that. And again, it's not that I think that it's bad to have 30% women on the board, but, I don't think anybody just wants it to be a box checking exercise. We still want merit. And so that's where sometimes, if companies are focused on simply getting a certain ESG score or checking a box, then I think that's where we fall flat on this kind of stuff.
Right. So, there was a time before ESG was around. And so how did companies deal with these things? And has it become a benefit, do you think, ultimately? Is it a detriment? Or is this the happy middle that you're looking for? And if so, how do we find that happy middle, do you think? Or do we scrap?
I think that there was sort of less focus on this. Again, it was sort of shareholder supremacy, and that's kind of all companies focused on. What does the next quarter look like? Maybe they might look out, I don't know, next 4 quarters. And so, I even think that there is a challenge with that. I think there is something to be said for problems that come from short-term thinking, be it with corporations or even, I'm going to argue within politics, this sort of 4-year cycle where they're I just got to get elected again. I just got to get elected again. It creates some short-term thinking. And so I think there is something to be said for looking at it a little more broadly. So I think that is one of the nice things about ESG is I think it has expanded how we do business or how we think about doing business. And so I think, companies probably didn't really think a whole lot about it, right? In Canada, we have a lot of regulations. We've got a lot of employment laws. We have a lot of environmental regulations.
Right.
Anybody who says the oil and gas industry isn't regulated, they don't know what they're talking about.
So the regulations are there in terms of, like you said, environmental, employment. And so then is this an overkill, or is this trying to streamline things? Was that the goal? And then, or do personal interests and unelected bodies, like you were saying, have they taken over? So what's your kind of assessment about where things are at on that right now?
Mhm. Well, I'm going to say they're probably somewhere in the middle right now. I think what ESG did was it encouraged companies to be transparent.
Okay, that's
Which I
good.
think yeah,
Transparency is good.
yeah, I was going to say there's nothing wrong with that. It's just, it's sort of, again, it appears to have sort of morphed into, companies followed regulations and, they did it. They did it kind of quietly. They didn't get sued. They didn't get regulatory fines, what have you. So they, like they just did it. But
Yeah.
now companies have to be much more public with it.
Cool.
And so, yeah, I think we're kind of somewhere in the middle of, we have this international body that's trying to tell everybody what they should be doing, how they should run their businesses, and then how they need to report it. But then on the flip side, this opaque business structure that we used to have of no reporting on this, I think was probably also somewhat problematic. So, we have some work to do, but we can meet in the middle, I think, to transparently provide employees, insurance companies, banks, investors, community people, as well as even your politicians. I think they can all benefit from having some additional information on how companies are operating.
And it's interesting that companies have had to be more transparent with these things. And companies are private institutions generally. Of course, there can be public entities as well. But, with the work that I'm doing, I'm trying to encourage Canadians to get involved and hold their government to account. But it's often really hard to do when there's not a lot of information that Canadians can have. So the transparency on a government level is so bad right now, I think. And it's interesting that governments are, because but this was more private. Like, it's not like governments told companies to do this, right? Or there was like some push for it later on, but it didn't start with the governments. But it's interesting that this is taken on in the private sector, as opposed to, like, there's not a huge push for government to be transparent and show this kind of openness about their policies or their maybe employment standards as well.
Yeah, there is a push for governments and public sector entities to start reporting, but you're absolutely right. It has really, really been driven by the financial industry over the last a little bit more than 10 years, 15 years maybe. The investment advisors, the asset managers, et cetera, are really saying, well, this is actually really important to us. We want to know, particularly what your climate risks are. And so you need to tell us, like, you need to report this so that we have access to it, because then we're going to decide if we're going to invest in your company. So you're right. Up until very recently, it has not been government edict. It has been really driven very, very much by the financial sector. But that financial sector, I think, has been quite influenced by a lot of global bodies, like some of them that I had previously mentioned, the UN, World Economic Forum, and, well, I mean, the UN and all of sort of its many, many, many bodies, environment, et cetera, the SDGs, all these things, all these different kind of UN-related groups have really had quite a bit of influence, I think, on the financial component or the financial sector's interest and involvement within ESG reporting.
Well, and like, when you say the financial industry is the one that kind of pushed it, ultimately whether their what their agenda was, we'll see. But like, it makes sense when they're looking at investing somewhere and they want to know what the risks are. So you have to at some point show the financial industry where the risks are, what the risks are, where you're good and where you're not good, I guess, as a company. So that totally makes sense. Like, I can see why there was a massive drive there. So do you think that the path, or initially it started off under good pretenses, and then maybe, you did mention, I think earlier, about the human aspect of trying to get along to be along. But the one other thing that I try to remind people to, like, especially when I talk about government stuff, is who is running the government? Really, it's people at the end of the day. And unfortunately, just because you start working for the government or become an elected official, all of your human instinct for selfishness doesn't just disappear because all of a sudden you're working for a public institution. It would be great if that happened, if all of a sudden that's divorced from your personality or your wants, but it just doesn't happen. And I think that also happens, like you were saying, the human component comes out in these things in a company as large as it is. Like, it's made up of people at the end of the day. So do you think that it's been going on the right direction and it needs a course correct anyway, or it's just part of learning? And like, are you you're an advocate for ESG? Like, tell me maybe more about what you do as well, because so that I think will help provide context.
Well, I don't call myself an advocate for ESG. So the way that I often say it is, I'm neither disciple nor detractor.
Okay.
This is happening, and I'll kind of speak again on an energy vein, but we're seeing a disruption within energy right now. Consumers are demanding lower emissions sources of energy and products. Like, there is a real shift in consumer preferences. And so, companies can go the way of, I don't know, BlackBerry, Blockbuster, Kodak, whatever, and they can get pushed out of the market, or they can find a way to adapt and kind of work with where the consumer preferences are going. Now, I say that with the caveat that, there are sort of limits on maybe where we can take certain energy sources. Like, there are those consumers that think we could go to 100% wind and solar tomorrow. And I mean, that is just abjectly wrong. So, again, there are some limitations to what can be done, but companies do have to acknowledge that these kind of things are happening. As well, they have to acknowledge that many jurisdictions around the world are implementing mandatory sustainability or ESG reporting standards. And so, to be on side of securities regulators in various countries, or even do business as part of someone's supply chain in certain parts of the world, you have to comply with this. You have to at least be aware. You have to be in some way measuring, recording, and reporting certain information. So that's where I say, I kind of take an agnostic view on it. I think that where I could maybe say I'm an advocate for it is I accept that it's happening, and I advocate for companies embracing it before they're kind of forced by governments or they get in trouble with the regulators. Get in front of it, know what it is that you need to do, and then find the ways to use it to your advantage to improve your business practices. It doesn't have to be this great battle that I think that we're seeing a lot of times. So, there are things to push back on. Like, there's a very large decarbonization, I believe a very over anti-oil and gas, or oil, gas, and coal bias built into the international reporting standards. I think it's okay to push back on that and say, hey, you know what, this just is not reasonable. But I think to simply say, you know what, this is going away tomorrow, I'm not doing it, I don't think that that's a realistic approach to take either.
So you mentioned a few companies there and like suggesting that they were pushed out, and you're saying that's because of this ESG stuff or other things, and like they just weren't ahead of the curve enough. Like
Yeah.
Kodak, I think is a good one. Yeah.
Yeah.
And BlackBerry, I guess. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, at one point in time, these were sort of the market leaders, and then consumer preferences shifted. And so I think, again, you kind of just have to be realistic about things and not necessarily dig your heels in. And I really speak to the oil and gas industry when I say this, because I've worked with many people who are like, everybody needs our products. Like, we don't need to advertise. We don't need to tell them, like, it's great. Like, we're just going in this direction. But I don't think that that's a really helpful perspective or narrative to put out there either, right? As I say, I don't think there's an energy transition happening. I think there's an energy transformation happening. But that is really being driven by consumer demand.
So this is where maybe it'll be a bit of a challenge, or maybe you could help educate me, because what I found, and I think there's stats, but I don't have anything in front of me, is that, a lot of people want to have it. So I'd like to hear more about what the market is showing and what consumers are showing, because my understanding is people are calling for a lot of, more efficient things. But then when you ask them if they're willing to pay $20 or $100, I think there was a big study about this, more a month in order to reduce your energy footprint, in the end, they're like, actually, I'm not that interested, it turns out. So where is that market drive coming from? And are you familiar with that? Like, are people really showing that they're going to put their money where their mouth is, or their, I always get those things wrong. I think I got it right.
No, that is such a great question. And I think it's such an important component of this discussion that I don't think is had enough. Yeah, everybody wants sustainable products. They just don't want to pay for them. Yeah. I did read one study, and I want to say that it was like commissioned by the CBC a number of years ago, 3, 4, 5 years ago, where the outcome was something like people wouldn't pay more than $10 a month, more than like your Netflix subscription a month for sustainable or carbon emission reducing initiatives or products. And so I think it does go to that. But another study that I did read, I want to say maybe a year and a half ago, I think is probably the most telling. What they determined was that it's wealthy people that are willing to pay more. And I think that's such an important part of the conversation. So I see it in two ways. As Canadians, I think regardless of what your socioeconomic position is, we are extremely fortunate and wealthy compared to many, many other people in the world. So we have that component of, we expect that developing nations are going to forego their sort of economic and social benefits from the energy consumption that we've had, because we don't want them to emit. And I think that is incredibly unkind and unfair. But then, there's also like bringing it down very local. There are a lot of people here in Canada and in Alberta who are struggling to pay their bills. And so again, it's like, how do you expect people to pay more when they're struggling to meet their basic needs? And so I think that study was incredibly interesting. And even like, that it showed sort of the wealthier people within the study, they were only willing to pay an extra maybe 25% more on a product. I think it was roughly what the number was. And I mean, that could really only be like a few dollars on a product. So it doesn't mean that they're all like running out tomorrow to buy, $100,000 Teslas.
Yeah.
People just, they either don't have the means to do it, or they don't have the desire to do it, even though they may think that that's the thing that they want to do. I mean, let's even look at it this way. Flying. A lot of people have concerns about the emissions from flights. But I don't know. I don't see a whole lot of people that are willing to give up their trip to Mexico in the middle of winter in Canada,
Yeah.
right? And that's, that's the discussion we have to have, is the consequences and the trade-offs to some of what we are trying to accomplish.
Yeah. Well, and I think what is a good thing to do is just to have conversations about it. And what you were saying just a moment ago is that we're just not having those conversations. It seems like there's a lot of like rah for it. And I find the exact same thing in the political sphere too, is like so many people complain and say everybody sucks and they're all corrupt. I'm like, okay, great. Well, why don't you get involved then? And it's like, oh no, I don't have time, or even I don't have the money to take a course to learn. And it's like, well, you can't have it both ways. You either have to get involved, but yeah, it's just, I found that was really interesting. So it's not surprising at all, obviously, that more wealthy people are able to, or are saying that, yeah, we'll invest a bit more. And then one thing when you were talking about Canada versus other countries too, is we are living in a very cold climate. Like, so, it's one thing for luxury items or a trip to Mexico to be, like having an increased cost on it, for example. But not only is it an incredibly cold country, but a large country. Like sometimes you need to get on a plane to go visit a relative, or, for business reasons or family reasons. So it's not always a luxury item. Having heat in Canada is not a luxury item in the winter. So we have to recognize that too. We can't just say, oh yeah, let's do this because in the end, maybe it's better, but it's actually incredibly onerous for some people and everybody in the end. But some people can absorb that cost more. So yeah, I think it's just important to have those conversations. And any idea how that can happen or where you're seeing those conversations happen? Or is it just the activism and then the denialism and kind of nothing in between?
Well, maybe I can share some of my advocacy tips that I give people for oil and gas, but I think, it isn't unique specifically to oil and gas or energy. I mean, I think a lot of these things, they apply to everything, politics, what have you. And I think, first of all, a lot of times we just have to stop apologizing and kind of be proud of what we have. And I find Canadians are extremely apologetic for the lifestyle that we have. And we're very fortunate. I think we need to have a ton of gratitude for what we do have. But we also have to be proud of what we have, what we've created, what we've accomplished as Canadians. And I do think it can be as simple as talking to your family and friends. Be it politics, be it ESG, be it energy, what have you. If you have some expertise on the topic, I think that it's imperative that we do have we'll call them these local discussions with the people around you. And I think it is okay to challenge perceptions. The world is not ending. I don't think that we're at imminent planetary collapse due to exceeding the carbon budget next year. I know some people will disagree with me, but I come with a fair amount of optimism about the world and about humans within it. And so I think it is okay to normalize a different conversation by having the courage to talk to people on social media, talk to your neighbor, what have you. And then I think that one of my big concerns is with our media, there seems to be a lack of curiosity. There's a lack of objectiveness. There's always a lot of emotion put into articles that I don't even think need to have emotion.
Yeah.
A lot of, angry, scary adjectives are used. And I think it's okay to challenge them. I've written to multiple news outlets challenging their articles, just challenging their assertions. They never get back to me. I doubt they ever change them. But actually, I will share this story. Probably one of my more prominent articles was a number of years ago, National Geographic wrote just an absolute horrendous hit piece on the oil sands. It was just full of complete misinformation. And so I wrote to them. And I found emails for the board members and their executives, and I tagged all of them on social media. And Jason Kenney, when he was premier, he actually posted it up on his Facebook and Twitter page. And one of the board members for the company I was working for, she read it and she said, because of my article, she canceled her subscription that she had had. I think she'd had it for a couple of decades. She said, I was so disgusted, I canceled my subscription. So you really actually can affect change as one person just by speaking. And then the other thing on the political front that I think works on all topics is talk to or write your MLA, your MP, your councillor. I have been told, and you can corroborate, Eva, if you know this, I've been told by multiple politicians that if they're getting like 3 to 5 emails on the same topic, like they are like, holy smokes, we have a crisis. Like this is something I have to address. And so 3 to 5 letters, that's not an awful lot. Like there's a lot of people out there that can passionately and respectfully write to our elected officials.
Well, I 100% agree with this, obviously. And so what I like the emotional aspect of some articles that I read, and I just don't understand it either. It's not helping anyone. I think it sows more division, obviously. And really, in the end, I think it's harming the next generation. Like kids are apparently, traumatized and think that the world is coming to an end. Like why would you do that to the next generation? I just don't understand it at all. I think it's incredibly foolish. If they're benefiting in some ways, I just don't understand how they justify that. But what I just want to touch on a little bit is, you're in a great position to educate in National Geographic and point out the mistakes. And I think that that's such an important part of when we're having these conversations. You mentioned obviously respect, but having a bit more knowledge, because that's another thing I find people just jump in and they just start arguing and yelling about something. And it's like, maybe let's just take a moment to educate ourselves a little bit more. And I get it right now. It's really hard because there is so much misinformation out there. Like, most people would take what the National Geographic's magazine said and took it for their word because it was a credible organization and they probably still have some good articles, but you throw one in like that and that messes with the credibility. So I think I try to remind Canadians as much as possible, knowledge is power. So getting educated first and then getting involved as well, that's like just such an important combination, because then you could call people out on these silly things that they're writing and the fear that they're instilling. So I really appreciate that. I didn't realize that only 3 to 5 emails to an MLA or MP is called a crisis. This is another thing that I think a lot of Canadians don't realize is coordinating a little bit. Like even if you write a sophisticated letter once you've gotten all the details and have 10 people sign it or 15 people sign it, that's very powerful as opposed to little old Eva Chipiuk writing a letter to her elected official. But if I can get 10 people behind that idea or that issue, 50 people, there's so much power in that. And that's what elected officials will be looking at. It's really interesting to see that just 3 to 5 people, that's already like, okay, people have come to us about this. They've taken the time to, write to us about this. And like, look at how you can affect change. So I really appreciate that and hearing your story about that as well.
Mm-hmm. And I should, before we move on, I should say, and I forgot this very important piece to my little National Geographic story. It was an online story, and they actually they adjusted it. They made some changes. I think they changed the headline and a couple of other things. I mean, it all happened so quietly. The damage was already done. Yeah. But they did. Yeah, they changed. And I'm not saying it was my letter, because I think that there was a lot of outrage from a number of people that said this is just wrong. And so, you actually can affect change.
Yeah, and I think it's so important to keep reminding Canadians that is available. So one thing I do want to get into a little bit about what it is how it is you work with people, because you did say that, you go into a company and some, are hesitant or not sure, but you could use it to their advantage, like an ESG movement to their advantage. So how is it that, like, what is it that companies can do? How can they be a bit more proactive so that it benefits them as well as, I guess, the broader community and world?
Hmm. So what I intend to do with my business is it'll sort of run the gamut depending on how much experience companies have within the ESG reporting space. But I think a lot of it is probably going to start with some education. My targeted audience, not exclusively, but it is sort of targeted towards smaller to medium sized companies, especially within industrial spaces. Um, I want to work with those companies to first start educating them, because I'm guessing some people are like, "What is this ESG thing?"
Yeah.
And then it's really working with boards, because boards are really the ones that are driving this. Um, they're driving it in part because proxy advisors through these asset managers are actually targeting board members. And, we're seeing it with the larger companies, but it was Exxon, I think, was kind of the first one from a more public standpoint where an activist investor came in and put two board members who were aligned with certain climate commitments onto that board, and obviously caused disruption. And so we are seeing sort of these activist investors who may be going after boards. And I mean, those are people's jobs. So people want to protect them. So there'll be sort of that education to boards. And then it will also be kind of looking at strategy. Well, what are you actually doing? And really trying to align with the compliance requirements. So there are voluntary international standards that have been put out by, they're ultimately put out by the IFRS, which is the International Financial Reporting Standards. So that's the reporting criteria that every publicly traded company within Canada and many, many, many other countries in the world other than the US have adopted. So they've created sustainability standards. So and Canada's in the process of kind of Canadianizing them, and they're going to go out for another round of consultation once the Canadian Securities Administrator kind of finalizes them. We're hearing any day now. And so then companies are going to have mandatory requirements if they want to trade on the stock exchange. Or what will also affect companies is down the supply chain. So companies who have to meet certain compliance requirements are going to have to have supply chains that comply with those compliance requirements too, right? So it kind of affects companies up and down, and that's kind of where we are seeing the need for, I guess, understanding what's happening. What is it that you need? What information do you need to know? Like, if you need to calculate your emissions, like we should probably get you working on that sooner rather than later, because emissions are very difficult to calculate correctly. And then I'm sure you're aware, Eva, Canada amended the Competition Act under Bill C-59 back in the summer. And that created quite a flurry within the oil and gas industry, because with that comes really strict regulatory guidance around greenwashing or environmental claims. Companies have to back it up in certain ways with an international methodology that's not defined and doesn't actually exist. But companies can be targeted like just by random complaints. And the penalties are really, really punitive. For individuals, it's upwards of $750,000. And for companies, it's up to $10 million per misrepresentation. And so I recently listened in on a webinar from one of the big four advisory consulting firms, and they said their analysis shows that there's roughly one misrepresentation per page of a company's ESG report. And so, like, the larger companies, they have, upwards of 100-page reports. So if that's 100 potential misrepresentations times $10 million, that's extremely punitive. So that's why it is incredibly important that companies have high quality verifiable data so that they aren't getting targeted.
Mm-hmm. And this is something I think I heard from somewhere, but correct me if I'm wrong. Are companies keen to have some of these measures and, do these things because then it helps in the end with transparency or investment? Because I think we hear a lot of, regular folk, at least I do. I don't talk to high-end executives and board members, but they just say, oh, this is all garbage and we don't need it. And this is just some kind of ploy. But are companies interested in doing this work and, using it to their advantage where they can? Do they see benefit in it in the end of the day?
I think some do. And again, I think probably the higher you go up within the corporate hierarchy, they probably understand it better. Like I do find that the boards typically have a pretty solid understanding of it, or, maybe they see the direct consequences of non-compliance a little better than, maybe people lower down in the hierarchy. They're like, oh, why do I have to gather this data? This is just another task I have to do on my busy day. Um, so but I mean, I still think that there is a lot of resistance because it is going to be expensive for companies. Um, I I can share this piece of information. I sat in on a number of webinars with the Canadian body that's creating the Canadian sustainability standards. Um, and in concert with them, the Alberta Securities Commission has often had representatives. And so I did ask if there's been any Canadian costing done, a cost benefit analysis. And unfortunately, there hasn't been. But what I was told by the Alberta Securities Commission was to look at the Australian Treasury's report and cost benefit analysis. So I did. Well, Australia estimates that within the first year, companies will spend on average $1 million, $1 to $1.3 million reporting. Now that's Australian dollars, but they're pretty close to Canadian dollars. And then they estimate roughly $500,000 to $700,000 per year after. Obviously, smaller companies won't spend as much, but it is very expensive, and so there is bound to be resistance to these kind of things. But maybe another thing that I will share in terms of what I want to do with my consulting business is encourage individuals and companies to be part of the consultation processes as we go along and create these standards. I can help companies write letters and speak at it from a more technical perspective. I think again, I'm kind of innately an advocate, and so I really feel strongly about being a part of consultation. You can't expect government bodies or non-governmental bodies to know that you're unhappy about something if you don't tell them. They can't know, they can't change what it is that they do if they don't have suggestions for how to make improvement. And so I encourage everybody to be part of consultation processes that affect you. If your company is going to be affected by mandatory sustainability reporting standards, know what's happening, get educated, know what will and will not work for your company, and be a part of the consultation process.
So important. And I just want to point, I don't think this is the first time something like this has happened, and I don't think it's going to be the last. So it's important to be involved in. The kind of other thing that comes to mind for me is the accessibility requirements that were put on businesses. I suspect that there was some consultation in the background, but I suspect a lot of businesses didn't take them up on it. And now there's very onerous requirements on businesses to have accessible options for clients that they may never have. And I think that's something businesses need to get better at. And Canadians, in advocating for themselves, like government is not really good at looking at what that cost is to businesses because they don't appreciate it. And I think that Canadians and businesses have to be a little bit better at exactly this, advocating for themselves, but also working together to get their message out, because $1 million for a company is, that's nothing. But for, I think the majority, $1 million in order to do something like this is a lot. And same with, a small business that has to take on an extra 50 grand or something to have accessibility bathrooms. And no, I don't think anybody really had that conversation at the beginning. So it's crazy that, you asked what was the cost benefit. And I think that happens time and time again. So we really have to have those conversations when government is, jumping in, trying to save the world. But it comes at a cost. So,
Yeah, I think you're right. And I think we can maybe be a little compassionate toward some of the rule makers, because it's not always that they come at it with a malicious intent. I think sometimes they just don't know. And I'll share another story for the audience. I was fortunate to be part of a delegation with an oil and gas industry association group. We went to Ottawa last November, and we met with a number of senior government officials, deputy ministers, policy experts, etc. And the last meeting we had was with the senior policy analyst for Transport Canada. And, we had a very nice conversation about some of the industry's issues. And then she shared with us what Transport Ministry's goals were. And she mentioned decarbonization. So I asked her, well, could you clarify what that means to the ministry? And she proceeded to talk about, well, we're going to electrify equipment and trucks and, all these things. And she was like quite excited about this. And you had two of us that worked for hydraulic fracturing companies in the room. These are giant pieces of equipment that use an awful lot of energy. And they operate in very remote regions with no grid. And so my other counterpart said, that's it's going to be quite difficult to electrify our equipment. We often work in remote locations. And she said with a straight face, oh, that's okay. The government's planning to expand charging infrastructure across the country. And in that moment, I realized she's probably never left the Ottawa bubble. She has no idea what or how remote Canada is and what that looks like for a lot of industrial activities. So, we had an opportunity to at least kind of nudge her in a different direction.
Well, even the fact that it's like, oh, don't worry, government has the answer. Again, like, no, where are you getting your money for? And why do you think you have the answer? Like, if a private company can't figure this out, I don't think that you're, the hero with the red cape. Anyway, just so interesting to hear that, but it doesn't surprise me at all. But I think we'll wrap it up there. That was incredibly interesting and informative. Where can people find you if they're interested in learning more or using your services?
Sure. So I do pretty much all of my energy advocacy, social media related on LinkedIn. So please feel free to connect with me. And if you send me a direct message, I pretty much always reply. I get published in energynow.ca, so you can subscribe to that free online energy magazine. And you can also reach me through my website or my email. Maybe we can put it in the show notes for my business, equipoisability.com. And I spelled it a little bit uniquely, so hopefully we can actually put it in the show notes for people to connect with. And I'm always happy to talk with people about ESG and energy.
And advocating for themselves.
Yes.
Excellent. Well, thank you again so much. That was excellent. We're just going to do a few more minutes for the paid subscribers, so we'll be back shortly.